Well, you have to forgive me a little bit this morning. If I come across a little hoarse, I told you guys a few weeks ago how I'm that parent at sports games for your kids and stuff, and I was that parent yesterday. So I'm a little hoarse from shouting wonderful encouragements to everyone on the field yesterday morning. But yeah, so if I get a little gravelly, that's what's up with that. I promise I'm okay. I'm not really okay, but you know what I mean. Yeah, what's going on? So I can still vividly remember last year, early last year, it was in February. I can remember sitting outside, parked outside the arrival terminal of the Norfolk International Airport, waiting for my parents to get off the airport, get their baggage, and come out after their 31-day cruise. I mean, that was insane. That was one of those things that they said, we're glad we did it, we'll never do it again. But I can remember because I remember as they were coming off, there was a lady who came out of the terminal, I don't know, a couple minutes before them, and she had a mask on. And I remember thinking at the time, what's up with that? And it was around that same time that we were beginning to hear in the news different stories about COVID popping up here and there. And we heard about cruise ships being kind of quarantined. In fact, my parents were just days away from, if they had gotten back just a couple days later, they probably would have been some of the ones stuck on their cruise ships out there in Los Angeles, like a few others were. But I can remember looking at them and thinking, like, what in the world was going on with that? And lo and behold, man, things quickly and rapidly changed, and that became a very common sight. We began to see things, and really we begin to hear things now in words and phrases that kind of have, now they strike us in a brand new way. We hear words that aren't brand new words, but there are words that when people say them, they kind of bring different thoughts to our mind. Kind of like how for many of us, when we hear the numbers 9/11, we don't always think of the phone number we dial for emergencies. We oftentimes think of that terrible day that happened back in 2001 and how it shook our country and really it shook our world. And so in this kind of same vein, there's many words now that we hear that kind of strike us in a different way. Words like distancing or virus or vaccine or mask and all these different things of how they kind of hit us in a new way, all because of what's going on within our world. For a long time, we kind of were hopeful and kind of thinking that things would get back to normal. I remember sitting with Gabriella. Actually, I wasn't sitting with her. I was online with her. We were in a Zoom meeting. And we were talking about how, and maybe this was just my foolishness of how, I think we'll be back in person worshiping for Easter in a couple weeks. This was right after we had kind of shut things down and gone to online worship. And well, Easter rolled around and we still were not back in person. And we kind of went on and on then, and it kind of stretched out. And really, we're still going through all of these things now. And I really believe that as we are still a year and a half past the beginning of all of that, we are in a new reality. We are in a time that is very different than it was just a couple years ago. In fact, if you are on Facebook, if you're a Facebook person, every day different memories pop up on your notifications, and you can see the things that you posted on that day so many years ago. And it's funny because I'll look at those memories and I'll think, man, we had no idea. We had no idea what was coming down the road for our world. There are so many things that are different, and we can't deny it. We can't act like things are the same as they always were. Some of those things have changed, and they've been kind of difficult for us to deal with. Some of those things, I think, in some ways have changed, and they've kind of been a good thing. I know for our family, leading up to the moment of when everything kind of had to shut down, we were running like 1,000,000 miles an hour, and in many ways, we're still doing that, but it's in a different way, and it's kind of caused us to slow up and say, maybe we need to slow down, because we enjoyed the time where we were forced to do nothing, and we were allowed to kind of just be a family and be together. In some ways, some people have said that COVID has been an accelerator. It's brought about a lot of changes, a lot of things that were going to happen no matter what, but if anything, it just kind of sped those changes up. And we can see that in our culture, in society, but even within the church, there are a lot of different changes, and even within our church congregation, I would say there were a lot of changes that happened, that needed to happen, but maybe we just weren't there yet. But the situation has been the accelerator to get us there. I think in one way, the way that this kind of a new reality is that we're more online. I don't know about you, but I know that me personally, my family, the way that I do things in life, it's more online now. We have moved so many different things online. And I would say that when COVID first hit, there were a lot of things that were either online or were going online, but more and more we think in those terms. And when we, as a church congregation, had to do a little bit of a pivot, we brought Bible studies online. online. We brought our worship time online. We even brought some of the events online. Gabriella did our summer blast with our children's ministry. That's our kids' vacation Bible school. We call it Summer Blast. And they did that online. But even beyond that, there were a lot of different things in life that moved online. And even some of those things we still do today. Some of you actually work online at home. And I know some of you people are like, man, I hope I never go back from this. You know, you love that dynamic of being able to be in your home and be able to work. A couple weeks ago, Beth and I closed on our refinance for our house, and we did it sitting at the kitchen counter, staring at a laptop screen and a video phone call with a guy in Virginia Beach, closing on all these things and clicking a button to sign things here and there. I've even been a part of birthday parties over the past couple years where people joined into the birthday party online, virtually right there. And some of these things, you know, again, aren't new, but some of those things have been kind of brought about and kind of in a more quicker way, all because of COVID, because we're more online. And I think in some ways there's a lot of those things that are very positive, and we're blessed, like we've talked about many times, of even having our worship time. There's about, there was, I think, 8 or 10 people, it kind of bounces around, or 8 or 10 families that are online worshiping with us right now. And that's a huge blessing that we might have gotten to eventually, but it kind of pushed us a lot quicker to that point, and that's a huge blessing. But I think there's also some new things about this new reality that maybe aren't so great. I think in many ways there is more division. I think we can see in this new reality there's a lot more division. A couple weeks ago, we spent several weeks talking about some of that division and some of those ways that God has called us as His people to be a unified people and to be an example to others of how we love people and we are united together, and to be people who we can be an example to a fractured world. But the interesting thing is that I think even though before COVID and everything, there were divisions. I mean, you could say there was an us versus them kind of mentality with a lot of things. But I think even within those two different camps on different situations, there have now become divisions. And you can look within different circles that used to be unified, and now there is so much division even within the smaller groups. I think also another big reality in this new world we're living in is that there's more hesitation to church. Now, in many ways, there are people who are not regular churchgoers, who have never grew up going to church. It's never been a part of their life or whatever. They see it as even less of a need for them in their life. In their minds, there's a lot of for them to be focusing on, and a lot of things to be spending their time and energy working on and keeping managed and stuff. And so for them, they don't see the point of adding on just one more thing like church. But even, I would say for many regular churchgoers who it was a part of their life, for some of them, there's still some hesitation. Now look, I'm in no way saying that you have to come to this building to meet God, okay? In fact, it's sad, but I saw online, I was watching a video of another church's service this past week, and the pastor was talking about how God has a house, and you have to go to that house to meet God. And I thought, what Bible are you reading? Because I know in the book of Acts, I see that Stephen and Paul both said that God does not dwell in houses made by man. We don't have to go to a building to meet God, but man, we want to be able to do it. And I know there's a hesitation for many that they think and they wonder, man, but what if I go there and what if I get sick? I mean, we've talked about this morning about some folks within our church family that are still struggling with illness because of different things. And this isn't a faith versus fear issue. It's a hesitation, and there's a worry. And for many people, that's kind of a new reality for them as they think through places they're going to go, things they're involved with. And there are probably other dynamics that are mixed into this reality. And see, I think the problem, and the reason that I bring up this new reality here on this morning of us talking about our Vision Sunday, is that I believe that a lot of times when we face crisis, or when we face times like this, where we're in a moment and it can feel overwhelming, it can feel unsettling, and it can kind of mess with us emotionally and mentally. When we find ourselves in the midst of these times, we can focus on a lot of things. And I think sometimes we can even focus on things that maybe we shouldn't be zeroing in on focusing on so much. In many ways, for a church, for us as a church, we focused right away on how can we stay connected? What can we do to keep our church family connected in the times that we couldn't do it? I think it was about 12 or 13 weeks that we did at-home worship solely. We didn't have any in-person services, and we said, what can we do to try and stay connected? I mean, it wasn't the idea that if you didn't come to church one Sunday, well, you'd sink your faith and you'd lose it all. But we did recognize that month after month of not being able to meet with God's people and be able to worship with God's people and be able to connect with other Christians, it could have a very strong effect on our faith. And so we asked questions like, how can we do this? How are we even going to pay for things that we have to pay for as a church family, as a church body, if we can't be able to do this together? And again, I think the problem is that when we face times of crisis and we face times of hardship like that, is that we can get hyper-focused, but we can get hyper-focused on the wrong thing. Author John Acuff said it perfectly when he said, it's easy to get focused on the what and miss the why. It's so easy for us to get caught up in the what of what we are doing and completely and totally miss why we're doing these things. And this is what I mean. We could have, as a church, gotten really wrapped up in the idea of we got to figure out a way to have Sunday worship. We got to figure out a way to have life group. We got to figure out a way to have events like our cookouts and our chili cook-off and chocolate throwdown, which, by the way, is coming back in January. That's right. Yeah, we're excited about that. But we could have focused on those things and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to have these things? And we could have missed the whole reason of why we were trying to have those things. If all we were doing is trying to just keep those programs, keep those events, keep those things running and miss the reason why, well, that enthusiasm, that involvement would quickly dwindle. And so today, I want us to take some time, and I want us to kind of get into Scripture. And even in the midst of this month of the greatest month of generosity ever, I want us to think about the vision that God has called us to. I want us to think about what our why really is so that we can continue on to follow God in the what that He's called us to. And we're going to look at a reaction that God's people had to a really huge crisis moment for them. In fact, if you have your Bibles and you want to go to Nehemiah in the Old Testament, you can go there. We'll have our text up on the screen. There's also some Bibles in the seats in front of you if you want to use. But we're going to see what did God lead Nehemiah to do with his people when they faced crisis? How did they back up and consider their why before they jumped into the what of it all? Now, let me kind of give us some context before we get into Nehemiah in chapter 1. God's people were chosen. The Israelites were chosen out of all the people of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we see that when God sent His Son, He came to redeem all people. And really, there was so much pointing ahead to Him and of how He would come, and all people can now be God's people. It wasn't just one specific group anymore. But in those days, God chose out of everyone. He chose the Israelites to be His people. And He brought them to this place called the Promised Land. And when they get there, God blessed them and gave them all that they could ever want and even more. But over and over again, they would fall into temptation, fall into sin, and they would fall away from God. And so God would come in and He would rescue them. And then they would be with Him for a while and they would fall back into temptation. And over again, this cycle. But unfortunately, it came to a point finally where God kind of reached a point with them where He sent them probably in the most devastating way, their punishment for them to go through. And they actually found that the Babylonian Empire and the Persian empires come in and take them away from their home, take them away from this promised land, and take them as prisoners of war. And so we find about 100 years later, we find Nehemiah, who is serving one of those empires, serving one of those kings, and we see it in Nehemiah chapter 1 in verse 1. It says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 12th year, where I was in the citadel of Susa, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah and some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. Now let's kind of pause there for a second. For Nehemiah, he faced a very important moment here. He faced really a very important what and really a very important why. The what for Nehemiah was that his ancestral home was in ruin. What was known as the city of God had been decimated and was falling apart. And he felt like he needed to do something about it. And we see the beginnings of his why. We see the beginnings of this vision, this calling on his life to return and rebuild Jerusalem. This was his why. This was his vision. You see, a vision starts with a burden. That's what it starts with. It starts with a burden. It was something that is heavy on your heart. It's a problem that you feel deep within your heart, deep within who you are, and you feel like, I have got to do something about this. For Nehemiah, it was the fact that his home, the home of God's people, was in ruins. Specifically, it talks about the walls here. Now, the walls, whenever the walls were mentioned in the Old Testament, they meant more than just the literal walls. Yes, I'm sure the walls of Jerusalem had kind of been crumbled and fallen apart, but the walls meant kind of the essence of a city, the fortitude of the city, how strong it was, whether or not it would really stand. In fact, some scholars believe that the very first battle into the Promised Land, the Battle of Jericho, you know the old song, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. There you go. That some scholars believe that when the Bible talks about the walls of Jericho falling, that it may not have been the literal walls of Jericho that fell, but it may have been more symbolic of the fact that when God's people marched around there and God sent his people in to attack it, that the walls fell, that the city of Jericho fell, that they couldn't stand against God. And it really doesn't matter. We're not going to get into whether or not that's literal or figurative, but the point is that the walls for these people meant so much. And so when Nehemiah hears that the walls of God's city are in ruin, for him it broke his heart. And for him there was this brand new vision that God was beginning to build within him in this burden. Now for us, as Smithfield Christian Church, our burden is for our community. For us to how we can love our community like Jesus. That is our why. That is why we are here. That is why we do these things, because we want to love like Jesus. We want to be in a community that brings the love of Jesus to the people who need it. There's an organization called ESRI, and the ESRI, they stand for something. I don't know what it is. You can look it up and find it later on. But they do surveys. They do kind of demographic studies of different areas and stuff like that. And they actually did some surveys and studies within this area. And one of the things that I found within the survey is said that 27% of the people in our community would say that they regularly attend church. And it's like, oh, that's great, 27%. That's so wonderful. But then we read, it says also that 35% of people in our community say that they rarely attend church. And I don't know about you, but when I take surveys, I sometimes answer in the way I feel like I should answer. And so I think we could probably even adjust that number some and maybe bring it closer to 30% of people in our, go up a little bit more and say either 38 or even 40% of the people in our community would say that they rarely attend church. And again, we have no delusions of thinking that just by coming to a church or to this church on a Sunday morning that you're now somehow magically a good person, or that walking through these doors somehow miraculously saves you. But we recognize that when people are not engaged in a church community, that they are missing out. They're missing out on the support of being able to go alongside people through this life, because man, life is tough, and we've seen that again over the past year and a half, how difficult life can be. And we see how people sometimes have to go through that life on their own. And not only without God's people, but without also the encouragement of being able to worship God collectively. I don't know about you, but when we come into here, Beth mentioned it earlier of how it's a privilege and a blessing to be able to come in here and to sing these songs, not just because they sound great, but those lyrics and the words that we're singing back to God. I love that song, Evidence, that we sang earlier about how we can see the evidence of God's goodness in our life. And of not being reminded about that, man, that's a tough thing to go through life and to never have that opportunity with other people who love God to stop and to worship Him and thank Him for that. The author of Hebrews talks about the blessing of being a part of a community of believers. He says in Hebrews 10:24, "And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, all the more as we see the day approaching." And again, I love the fact that not only are we able to worship in this room right here, but we're even able to worship with other people worshiping with us online, that we're able to spur each other on in that way too, because we need that encouragement to be worshiping together, to be meeting together. And I think there are a lot of people who aren't a part of a group like this, not because they're bad people, not because they're evil people, and I think even for a lot of those folks, not because of a lack of faith in God, but because they just don't realize what they're missing out on. That they're missing out on a community of people who are celebrating God's love and trying to bring that love and that blessing to the community around them. You see, that's our burden as Smithfield Christian Church. That's our why. That's why we do worship services. That's why we do Bible studies and life groups and events. And without that why, all of the what that we're doing, it really doesn't matter. And I would say if all we ever did was the what and the things, and we never thought about why are we doing this, and we never brought it back to that purpose, then friends, then we failed as a church. Our why always starts as a burden. But if we go back to Nehemiah in chapter 1 and verse 4 again, Nehemiah says this, "For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before God of heaven." You see, Nehemiah felt that burden for his home and what his home represented and what those walls represented about his home. And so he did something. And what did he do? Well, I think about what I would have done in that situation. You know, I'm a type of person that when I get overwhelmed by feeling like, well, we got to work out a plan for something. Something's got to be done about this. What I typically do is I go and grab a dry erase marker and I go down to the classroom down the hall where the kids do their worship time, and I start writing out my thoughts and my ideas and my plans out, and I try to get a structure and a plan together. But Nehemiah doesn't do any of that, and it's not just because they didn't have marker boards back then. But instead, Nehemiah, he went and he fasted and he prayed before God. And when we see the words fasting and prayer mentioned together in the Bible, it means more than just a quick, tossing up a word to the big man upstairs and anything like that. But when we see that God's people would fast and pray, man, this was serious business. This was a big deal for them. It was an opportunity that they were trying to clear everything out of their life, all the distractions out of their life, to give God room to work on their hearts and to develop that burden and that vision that he was giving them. You see, because not only does it start with a burden, but our vision is developed then by God. We need to give God the time. We need to give God the opportunity to develop that vision in our heart. Some scholars believe that Nehemiah would have probably mourned and fasted and prayed for like 4 months. Now, most likely he didn't fast the entire 4 months. He probably took breaks here and there, but I'm pretty sure he prayed that entire time. He spent time praying. In fact, we have a little bit of a glimpse of some of Nehemiah's prayer in verse 5 now. "Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven and the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as my dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to this prayer, this your servant, and to this prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." This was probably Nehemiah's prayer, or like this, day after day after day, over and over and over. Maybe not these exact words, but it was probably the same feeling and the same burden. For us here at Smithfield Christian Church, our prayer for a long time is, God, how can we love our community? 7 years ago, when I was first a part of this church, the way that we said it was, how can we honor God, make disciples, and love generously? And in the beginning of this year, we kind of narrowed that focus down to simply say, God, how can we love like Jesus? How can we be a people that love like Jesus? How can we do what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25:31? It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit in his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will pull the sheep to his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. You see, friends, we want to be among those who one day God says to us, come on, come enjoy your inheritance. those of you who are a part of my family, because you were faithful, not just to me, but you faithfully loved my people of your community. You see, this is the prayer. This is our burden that God is developing in our hearts. Let's go back one more time now to Nehemiah to kind of see how he kind of reacts to all of this now. We see in the last verse of chapter 1, is where we're going to start in verse 11. He says, I was cupbearer to the king. And then he says in chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, well, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked him, how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, and so I set a time. I also asked him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so they will give me timber to make the beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. Okay, we need to kind of pause and take in all that just happened right there, because a lot of stuff really just happened, some pretty incredible things. Nehemiah, the cupbearer of the king, this guy who would basically bring in the food and the drink, and sometimes they would even taste it to make sure it wasn't poisoned, because, then he would die and not the king, but he brings in this food. He's just basically a lowly servant. He comes in and he's upset because his home, the city of God, is in ruins. And so when he gets to the king, he's kind of hoping that maybe the king will notice that he's upset. Have you ever done that before? You've been upset about something and you kind of like show it in hopes that they'll say, what's wrong? So you can kind of say it. And if you're saying, no, I've never done it before, you're a liar. And we will forgive you this one time. But the king notices that he's upset. And he says, what's the deal? Why are you upset? You're usually not upset. Now, again, remember who Nehemiah is. Nehemiah is a servant. He's essentially a prisoner of war. He's nothing important, but somehow he has enough rapport with the king that the king would even care to ask him, hey, what's wrong? And Nehemiah, he asks a big ask here. I mean, think about what he is asking. He is not just saying, look, I want to go home. I want to be out of this service and go home. No, he says, I want to go home to a nation that was conquered by your predecessor more than 100 years ago. I want to go home and I want to rebuild my city. I want to rebuild my family and God's kingdom there. I mean, do you get how big this was of what he was asking this king to let him do? I mean, that's a pretty bold thing to ask. And friends, our vision requires bold steps. Now, make no mistake that if God has a vision for you, if God has a calling for you, and he is pulling you into that place, then he is going to help you accomplish that vision for his glory. And so it's okay to be bold. I mean, otherwise, we don't really need God. If the things that are going on in our life aren't big, if what we're trying to do for God isn't really a big deal, and I'll just do this here and there, then I guess we don't really need God, and God's not going to be a part of it. And the thing is that we can make a lot of plans. Sometimes we do that. I know that I'm a planner when it comes to this kind of stuff, and I want to make a plan. But if we don't have God at the center of it, it's not going to survive. That's why in Proverbs 19:21 it says, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Or in Proverbs 16, verse 9, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. You see, there's something about doing big things and doing them for God. And Nehemiah took this big and bold step. And I think, friends, that God wants us to do the same thing. I think he wants you to do it individually in your life, and I think sometimes we come into those moments where we feel God calling us to take a personal big step for him. And friends, we need to be bold. Maybe even do like Nehemiah did and kind of pause and pray, say, God, help me in this moment, and then do it. Take that big step. But friends, I also believe that God is calling us as a church to take big and bold steps for him and not to be afraid. Now, I'm not talking about being foolish or doing things that are dangerous or rash. But those things, and that's why it said in those Proverbs to hold on to God's plans and God's ways and follow His plans. But when God lays a vision or a passion on our heart, even if it's a big one, even if it's a scary one, well then hold on, because God is about to take you on a ride of your life. Because when Nehemiah made this request, when Nehemiah asked this big request, not only did the king grant it, but he actually gives him even more than what he probably should have gotten. He gives him so much. He pours into that. And friends, I believe that God has called Smithfield Christian Church to this community. In 1960, when this church was started, I believe that God put this church here for a purpose. And that's the reason why this church is still functioning more than 60 years later. And truly, it's because He has called us here to be a congregation and a family that would love like Jesus. And sure, it may have been stated in different ways over the years, but He is calling us to do that here. To do more than just to come once a week and to be a church service where we feel good and we walk out of here and say, wasn't that nice? Didn't those songs sound so great today? Wasn't that a great message? Or whatever it might be. God has called us to a big vision. And so I want to ask you to ask yourself the question, will I be a part of this vision? Will I be a part of what God is trying to do even here within Smithfield Christian Church? And friends, I want to be very plain. We need all of us. We need each and every one of us, because God has made each and every one of us differently, with different passions and talents and abilities, and we need all of us. We need all of us to serve, to pray, to give, to help, towards the vision of loving this community like Jesus. Now, sure, we don't all do it in the same way, in the same manner, at the same capacity. That's why in 1 Peter 4, Peter says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as the one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To Him be the glory and power forever and ever. Amen. Peter got preaching there and he didn't even realize he was going. God has given each of us gifts and blessings in different ways. And so that means that you and I, we need to look deep within and say, God, how have you blessed me? How have you gifted me? What could you do with me within this church body, this church family? I'm excited because next week, Troy, he's going to be sharing up here and talking about how we can be generous and use the gifts that we have, the blessings and the talents that we have. How can we bless other people and be generous with our gifts and our talents? And then in 2 weeks, our friend Sam Gill from Pakistan is going to be here, and he is going to be sharing how God has called us to even use the small things in our life to do big things and to bless people in great ways. But friends, today I want to challenge you, and I want to ask you to be a part of this big vision. In fact, later on in our vision meeting, we're going to talk about some bold steps that we want to take as a congregation. And it's going to mean boldness within each of us. It's going to mean boldness within our giving. It's going to mean boldness within our serving and our prayer and working together. You see, even in our generosity challenge, we're giving you a bold challenge, a bold request today. If you've not been a part of our series that we've done this month, within this series of the greatest month of generosity, every single week we are challenging you in a different way to be bold and to challenge people. And friends, our challenge for you today is that if you've never made giving to God's church a part of your life, we're asking you to start doing that today. And this isn't just the preacher up on stage asking for your money. No, it's God asking you to make that a part of your life. In the book of Malachi, God asks us to bring the full gift, our offerings, into His church, into His body to be used for His glory. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says that we should give what we decide in our heart, and we should do it cheerfully. We should do it in a way of knowing that we are giving and we are partnering with God in making a difference in our community. And if you already give, if you already do that, then we want to challenge you to take the bold step of saying, well, what more can I do? How much more can I do? What can I do to be a bigger blessing in a bigger way for God's glory? But all of that, friends, all of this that we're talking about is built on this simple statement of loving like Jesus, because that's what we're all about. Friends, I really believe that God has called us to take bold steps towards loving people in our community. And I hope that even in the midst of this new, weird at times world, even in the midst of this new reality, that we can be committed to that, to loving like Jesus no matter what, no matter where we are, no matter what we might be facing. And I hope that we can partner together in this, and I hope that you'll be a part of it. Let me pray. God, I think of in times like this, I think about people who came before us. I think about maybe people who would have started this church back in 1960. I think of people who would have felt that burden, that need to put a church right here at 18420 Battery Park Road. And I think about what would have motivated them, God, and what would have pushed them in that way. God, I know that no matter how they may have said it, I know that their heart and their desire was to want to love Smithfield and love the area beyond for you. God, we know that sometimes that happens in different manners and different forms, and I'm sure that Smithfield Christian Church of those days would not be anything like Smithfield Christian Church of today, and that's okay, because we trust that you are guiding us and you are helping us to see how we can take those steps of how we can be moving forward and following you with the ultimate goal of not us being famous or that name being known, but for your name to be famous, for you to be known within this community. God, I do pray right now, I pray for the folks in this community that we read about in that survey, that 35 or maybe even more % of people who don't have a place that they can call their church home, who don't have friends who have a similar faith, who don't have a similar passion, maybe even a similar purpose. God, I pray for them as they go through life, because I know it's got to be hard for them to not be able to have the hope that we have, to not be able to have to not be able to cling on to what we cling to in those moments of darkness and trials. Lord, would you help us to love those people, even though we don't even know them yet? Help us to love them and to make room for them and to do our best to partner together to make a difference in their lives, Lord. I thank you for today. I thank you for those who came before us, Lord. May we honor them and honor you as we continue to move forward to love people like you do. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Every week we kind of finish things up with a song. And I mentioned this earlier, I love some of the words that we sing in these songs. This song that we're going to sing in a little bit, that we're going to kind of finish up, is all about recognizing what God has done within us. I want to encourage you, as you think about the bold steps, the things that God's called you to, even like how Nehemiah was called to take big steps in big ways. I want you to, as you sing this song, to think about, what is God calling you to? In what big ways, big steps has God called you to because of how he has made you and because of who you are, not because of Joe Thompson or Jim Snyder or whoever you might be, but because of who you are in God. And so why don't we stand and sing this song together in that?